Hello, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny and I'm leading this seminar on compassion today. Now, I know when I was asked to lead this session, I'm afraid part of me thought, oh, gulp, this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge to lead, and actually it's going to be a challenge to me. I used to work for Christian Aid before I had children, and I used to travel around quite a lot of the country talking about different global issues and how we should respond to them. And I have to say, if I'm honest, the last little while, global issues, compassion has slightly taken a back seat. There's just been so much going on in our family and in our neighbourhood, where we've been practising compassion a lot, that the wider issue of compassion, I think I've got a few challenges coming, and maybe going forward it's something we need to think about challenging each other on. So, in preparation for this seminar, I always like a seminar where there's a little bit of Greek, of Bible words, coming away with a little bit of extra stuff. So, I haven't read any Greek books, but Google. I have learnt a bit of Google Greek. Just made it clear I'm not a Greek scholar. It's going to be very simplistic, mispronounced. I hope it's going to be right. I'm sorry to any Greek scholars out there who are watching this. So, I was Googling the biblical word for compassion. Turns out compassion is used in the Bible about 39 times, and it's spread fairly evenly, sprinkled between the Old and the New Testament. Although in the Old Testament it almost always refers to the compassion that God has for us. And what's interesting is it's actually, the English word compassion is a translation of 10 different Hebrew and Greek words, all with subtly different meanings, all translated into our understanding of the word compassion. So I'm sure you can appreciate that's quite nuanced. Each of these words is going to have subtly different meanings, and we need to kind of pick apart, okay, well, what does compassion mean in this situation and in this situation? In this session, I'm going to look at 3 of the Greek words that are used in the New Testament, partly because, as I said, a lot of the words in the Old Testament are referring to compassion God uses for us, and some of them don't actually ever talk about compassion that we should feel. It's talking about how God feels for us, whereas these words in the New Testament are words that we are meant to put out as well. God feels for us, but also we should feel for others. Right, and to illustrate these points, I'm going to share about a fairly sad situation that's happened in our family this week. I know a lot of you know we have a lovely pet cat called Otis, but we also have 2 pet rats, or we did. Sadly, on Thursday night, the boys went to say goodnight to the pet rats, and Isaac's lovely rat Cinnamon, at the very reasonable old rat age of 2.5, had passed away. And I'm going to kind of share this story as we go in an illustration of the different workings out of compassion. So the first word I'm going to look at is the easiest to say, possibly the easiest to explain. Well, I say it's the easiest to say. I'm going to say sympatheo. I hope that's right. You can probably work out where the word we take from it, sympathy. Showing sympathy to somebody, sharing in their sufferings. An example from the Bible is in Hebrews 10 verse 34, where it says, "You sympathised with those in prison." Now, this has been something that's been talked about quite a lot in society recently, or certainly over the last sort of 5-10 years. I think it's often become called empathy, and people have talked about the difference between sympathy and empathy, but I think this word here is what currently would probably be described as empathy. It's talking about sharing in the sufferings of other people. Sharing in those emotions. there's been some fabulous illustrations on doing the rounds on social media. One of the most famous ones is by a lady called Brené Brown, which I'm not going to share here, but it's the idea of, she uses the word sympathy, so it's quite confusing, as in the sort of British quick fix. So we can see somebody's sad and we say, come on, it could be worse. Chin up. Let's get on with it. I'm sure you'll feel better in a bit. Just trying to make someone feel better. And she talks about actually that can be really negative in situations of grief, situations of depression. Trying to make someone feel better, trying to improve the situation, cheer them up, can be really, really destructive, because not only has it not worked, but they feel worse than they did before because it hasn't worked. So they were feeling fairly rubbish, and now they feel guilty because you failed to cheer them up. So this word sympatheo, I think, is that kind of a word. It's sharing in sufferings with other people. And in Brené Brown's illustration, she has somebody that's stuck in a deep pit. And she describes it as, rather than going, come on, I'm going to get you out of this pit, come on, let's get you up, let's make things better. It's actually climbing down into that pit with someone and sitting alongside them and saying, yeah, it's really rubbish, isn't it? I can't really understand what you're going through, but I'm here. Often Eeyore and his relationships with Piglet and Pooh are drawn upon as well. Eeyore never is very cheerful, but sometimes they'll just sit with him and feel sad with him. Now, I said I was going to share about the rats. So it was Thursday night. Pete and I were doing an online Zoom quiz when we heard a very sad wail, and Cameron said, Mum, Dad, come through. And we found that when they'd gone to say goodnight to the rats, Cinnamon wasn't moving anymore. And that was a situation where we needed to show sympatheo. Those kind of try answers about, well, he was quite an old rat, or he'd lived a good life, or we can get another one. They weren't really going to help the situation. What we needed to do was just sit with Isaac and recognise that it was really sad, that he'd really liked and loved this rat, and it was very sad that this rat had died, and to grieve with him. And just to kind of share that moment and recognise that for the time being, it was just sad. Isaac needed sympatheo. Right. The next word, I've got no idea if I'm saying it right or not. I have managed to find a sermon on Google that pronounces it, so I'm going to copy that, and it's called splagzimeo, possibly. It's got an awful lot of letters that include a Z and a G and a CHI. So we'll call it splagzimeo, and I'm sorry if I'm saying it entirely wrong. It's one of the most commonly found words for compassion in the New Testament. It's used 17 times, and it literally means to be moved in the bowel. Now, the bowel they would have used in the way that we would use our heart, as the seat of deep emotion. So to feel things so strongly, we feel moved. To quite like sympatheo, we're feeling that compassion, we're deeply moved. It can also be translated as courage, and sometimes is. But the difference between sympatheo, which is sharing in someone's suffering, and splagzimeo, I hope that's right, is to be deeply moved and then to respond. So it is used in many of the well-known parables. It's used in the parable of the prodigal son, when that son returns. He spent all the father's money and he comes back with his tail between his legs, preparing to ask if he could be the father's servant. And the father runs to him and he embraces him and he brings him back into the fold. He's moved by his plight, and he welcomes him back with joy. Sympatheo would be to welcome the son back, say, I'm really, really, really pleased to see you. Yeah, you haven't got any money though, have you? So, yeah, I'm sorry you're feeling sad like that, and of course you can come and work with me, but yeah, I'm sympathising with you. But we see the splagzimeo, that compassion where he goes above and beyond and is moved to respond in a bigger way. It's also the word used to describe the compassion in the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan is walking past this Jew, the Good Samaritan who's enemies with the Jew, and sees him naked, robbed. And again, he could have very easily walked past and kind of gone, oh, mate, really sorry, you are in a bad way, and walked on. But actually he feels moved, and he responds in a very costly way to help this man, to take him on his donkey, to take him to help and to pay for that help. So he feels that compassion. Out of that compassion, he is moved to do something. It's also the word that's often used to describe when we see Jesus seeing the crowds and taking pity on them and having compassion for them and healing the sick. And often that's a very costly thing to do because the crowds are thousands, and he's spending that time healing those people and being with them. So in our rat analogy, we had the sympatheo, where actually all we needed to do was grieve together. And then we moved on into the splagzimeo. Isaac's rat wasn't replaceable. You can't just buy a new rat and it makes it all better, and that would be ill-placed. But the boys had a rat each. So we had Rocky, and rats are sociable creatures, they're not meant to be alone. So we had a rat that needed a companion. And Isaac didn't want to replace Cinnamon, but Isaac also did want another rat. He was very sad. Now, you may not have guessed this. I don't know if it's got anything to do with COVID or anything to do with Brexit, but male rats in Norfolk are almost impossible to buy. Pete phoned every Pets at Home store in Norfolk. It took him several hours while I was at work. This was on his day off, obviously. And then when I got home, he said he'd had no luck. He rung everywhere. Not a single one of them had a male rat for sale. So I then kind of got my pen and paper out to Google, wonderful Google, and tracked down every breeder I could think of, every kind of independent pet shop I could think of, and rang all of them. Again, it took forever, but I did finally track one down in Norwich that had a rat and that was prepared to sell us that rat as a companion to Rocky. Now that was a fairly poor example. I know it's not an amazing analogy of splagzimeo, compassion. It was right to start with the sympatheo, compassion, to grieve. We couldn't fix the way Isaac felt. But then, actually, we were acting out of splagzimeo, compassion. We felt very sad about the situation, so we were moved to respond. It was a far more costly response than we thought because we had no idea it was going to be so hard to find a rat. But it was a compassionate response. So the final Greek word I want to look at is, I'll have a go, eleeo. I think that's right. And that can also be translated as mercy, to have mercy on, or to have pity on. This is something that in the Bible you might ask a judge for. So one of the parables it's found in is the parable of the unmerciful servant, which is found in Matthew 18. So a rich man had lent a lot of money to his servant. The servant couldn't repay it. The The rich man was entitled to have him thrown into prison, to have his family sold into slavery to pay the debt. But the servant begs for mercy, and the rich man has mercy on him. He lets off the debt. And then this unmerciful servant is owed money by somebody else. It's a much lesser amount of money, and he calls in that debt. He goes to this person and says, actually, I want you to pay me back. And the servant can't pay, so he has him arrested. And the master finds out, and the master is furious. He's let his servant off a huge amount of money, and the servant hasn't done the same for somebody who owes it to him. And the word there, the master says, shouldn't you have had mercy on the fellow servant just as I had on you? And that's this eleeo. Shouldn't you have had compassion? Shouldn't you have had mercy on this fellow servant? Now this word is the kind of other side to sympathy, or the sympatheo word. So the sympatheo word is to grieve with those who grieve, to feel an emotion and to share that with somebody. The eleeo word is to have mercy, to respond, but without necessarily feeling that strong emotion. So we've got to feel the strong emotion, but not respond. And we've got responding without feeling the strong emotion. And then we've got this splagzinome word, which is the both. To feel the strong emotion and to respond. But these are all biblical words for compassion. So it's not that this one is all right and this one all right and this one is better. They're all right in different situations. So to finish my rat analogy, my slightly random rat analogy, as we were ringing around all these breeders and all these pet shops, what we were asking for them to have on us was eleeo. I didn't need them to feel strong emotion for the situation we were in. I was asking them to have pity on us. Is it possible you've got a rat that we could buy? Is there anything you can do to help us? Will you have pity on us and help us in our problem? Okay, so as I said, we've got these 3 words, and we need to use these 3 types of compassion in different situations. It feels like as a nation in the UK, we have had a crash course in compassion over the last kind of 18 months. This COVID situation has been unlike anything I've ever lived through. I know people compare it to the Second World War. That's before my time. And we have had to respond. We have had on our screens, dreadful stories, images, situations that are heartbreaking and frightening in our country, in our county, of people who are desperately ill. And we've seen an incredibly compassionate, powerful response from the church and from the wider society to this situation. Just to list a few: food banks, the free school meals, the incredible kind of vaccination drive, as free things from volunteers we've seen in Sheringham, not to mention the kind of the healthcare staff going above and beyond, people working throughout lockdown, having to put fears for safety aside as they keep this nation going. Now, one thing I've reflected on is I find compassion so much easier to feel in situations where either I know the person I'm feeling compassionate for, or I can relate to the person I'm feeling compassionate for. In the COVID situation, the families it's affecting are families like mine. The people who are getting ill could be my family, could be my parents, could be my husband, could be my friends. I don't know if it was just me, but I know a lot of people were Googling, numbers of COVID cases in Norfolk. number of COVID cases in North Norfolk, number of COVID cases in Sheringham, there was this kind of fear that this situation could come and happen to us, and has happened to people we know. So our compassion, I think, or certainly for me, was sort of born out of a fear this could easily happen to me. So that verse, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, could very well happen. I'm doing unto others. It might be one positive swab, and it's our family who can't leave the house for 14 days with my lively boys, and having to depend entirely on other people to provide for us, provide the food, and all those kind of things. And that's the best case scenario. That's assuming we have a mild case. So it is, I can imagine people needing to do it to us, so I can have compassion on people in that situation. So we've seen a lot of people showing this splagzimeo compassion, this response where we felt strongly moved and then we felt urge to respond. I'm sure for some volunteers though, I think for us at times and for some people on the front line, actually we've gone beyond strongly moved. We're tired, we're scared, we're exhausted, and actually we're responding out of an oleeo response, out of mercy, out of pity. Car park volunteers on an icy day, or people getting shopping in for other people when those roads were like an ice rink. The compassion on that day, maybe more for us at the thought of having to stand out in a car park for 2 hours and being freezing. But the movement, the action is out of mercy. A bit like we often talk when we're talking about worship, about how we should worship all the time, not just when we're feeling it, but all the time as a choice. And I think sometimes compassion's a bit like that. It's the oleeo compassion of, okay, I'm not really feeling it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to take the day off. It means I'm going to show compassion anyway. I was reflecting on the sympatheo part of how does that fit in with the COVID crisis. And I was thinking, actually, I wonder if that's the bit that as a society we didn't necessarily do quite as well. Situations we heard of where the supermarket shelves were being wiped out because everybody was wanting to make sure they had enough. They weren't showing sympatheo, compassion with other people. They were worrying about themselves and whether they were going to run out of loo roll. I know a lot of people felt once the supermarket's shelves were more stocked, they found that a really difficult, stressful place to go because we weren't showing that sympatheo, compassion for other people. You had some people where leaving the house and going around the supermarket was terrifying. And they really needed to know that people were going to stay their social distance and keep those precautions in place. And there were others where they had very different understanding. Maybe they were in a desperate hurry. They were maybe a young parent, so they had a limited time to get around the supermarket. They didn't feel at particular risk. They felt that the risks were lower, so they just wanted to get around quickly and didn't want to wait behind someone in a kind of very long social distance queue. And we didn't show that sympatheo, compassion to each other very well all the time. So supermarket shopping became quite a difficult thing. And we certainly didn't show that sympatheo, compassion to the heroic staff in places like Tesco's and Sheringham who had to deal with those kind of tensions as we didn't empathise with each other. So we've had a lot of practice at compassion for each other throughout the COVID crisis. And I think generally we've done a really good job. And as a church and as a country, we've got a lot to be proud of. I think the challenge we now need to take forward is how are we going to show this compassion globally? So the challenge going forward after our local compassion and our crash course in that, and the fact we've got loads to be really proud of, is how are we going to take that compassion forwards globally? How are we going to respond not just within our neighbourhood in situations we can relate to, but further? God has made it very clear that we are we are all his children, so we shouldn't just care for our friends. The Good Samaritan, you should care for people who are different to you. I felt really challenged on the fact that I have spent far more time showing compassion to my son in looking for a rat than I have to any of God's children around the world as far as the global situations are concerned. At the moment, we know from the news that India is really struggling with COVID, so that's a big global crisis going on there. And there are other stories that just get edged out at the moment because there's so much going on here in the UK. And I challenge you sometimes to go onto the websites, the news websites, and just click the world button once in a while and see what's going on further afield. A couple of kind of changes to the law that are very concerning. The UK is looking at changing the way refugees come to this country. You might have picked this up on the news a bit. A lot of big charities are very concerned about it because they're saying refugees who come from legal routes, who come here with a visa, are going to face preferential treatment over refugees who come here illegally. And charities are pointing out, actually, if you're escaping a oppressive regime, or if you're escaping persecution, there's lots of situations where your government is not going to grant you a visa if they're the ones who are persecuting you. So that's something we need to be thinking about as a church, and whether this is fair. Another thing that's sort of been in the news a little bit is the UK government is changing our aid budget from 0.7% to 0.5% of our GDP, which in real terms is about £4 billion lost in aid around the world. So that's £4 billion less to charities, to projects around the world that the UK has been supporting. How does that make you feel? Because if I'm honest, I listen to those kind of facts and it doesn't make me feel the way I feel when I hear about a family in Cromer where they've been infected with COVID and there's a very real chance someone's going to need to go to hospital. That makes me want to do something. But these abstract figures about laws changes, that doesn't provoke the same response in me. One of the things that somebody very wise said to me is compassion is born out of knowing God. So the closer we are to God, the more likely we are to feel God's compassion, to feel his heart for these situations. So these are things we can take to God in prayer. I think I find it easier to feel compassion for people rather than crowds, if that makes sense. It's compassion for a person rather than a country. Lots of charities can help you get to know those people. I've been following a page on Facebook, Care for Calais, which is supporting refugees in Calais. And they tell the stories of some of these refugees in those situations. And right or wrong, whether they should be there or not, actually reading about the individuals who are there gives a very different perspective on the situation than reading headlines. We know about Sam and Chloe Mutton out in Kenya, and we know about Alex and Ellie Hawke and the work that they're doing out in Cambodia. They can tell us stories and put faces to statistics. That's true for a lot of charities, and one challenge I'm going to try and take forward, my charity leaflets are a little bit like junk mail. I've signed up to a lot, I get a lot of stuff through, it lands on my doormat, and I'm busy. I often don't read any. I'm going to try and find one and stay up to date with them so that I can get to know these stories. I can get to see where these projects are working, and I'm hoping that's going to help me feel more compassionate about the people in that situation. So that's a sympatheo. We want to feel that compassion, understand. And then there's the response. So I guess we really want that splagzimeo response. We're feeling that compassion and we're moved to respond out of that compassion. But equally, there's the eleeo. Even if we don't feel that compassion, that is not a reason not to show mercy, not to show compassion. So we pray. We say, God, show us your heart, show us your compassion for these situations which we know in our heads we should feel compassionate about, but if we're honest, we don't feel. But in the meantime, show us. We will respond out of eleeo, compassion. I think we need to walk this tightrope quite carefully. Sympathy in these situations, sympathy I think is really important when we're dealing with grief, when we're dealing with depression and relationships. Sympathy in global situations, we can pray, that's very, very important. But if we just feel sympathy and don't do anything, I don't think that's the right response. The eleeo response, we need to make sure we recognise that these people are children of God and these people are not just problems to be fixed. That's the kind of tension we need to hold. So how can we respond? Well, we can give, sounds very obvious. For some of you, that might not be where your financial situation is at the moment. Pray about it, but if that's not for you, this isn't a guilt trip. But for some of us, I think a challenge for me is thinking, well, what are my luxuries? I found the food bank, another local project, easy to give to because I can wander around Tesco's or wherever it is I'm shopping and I can think, right, 1 box of cornflakes for me, 1 box of cornflakes for the food bank. And I can relate. So I was thinking maybe I need to do something similar. Maybe I need to give my box of cornflakes or the equivalent of my Netflix subscription or the same as the price of my newspaper. I need to give that globally. And again, there's lots of good charities out there. If you're not sure of one, Google's a great place to start, or relationally. There's lots of people in this church who are involved in some incredible charitable organisations. We can act. And we are so privileged to live in a democracy. We have a representative that we have voted for, whether or not they were our choice of MP. They have an obligation to respond to their voters. We can put pen to paper, and it's even easier now. We can send emails. We can easily find, again, I've mentioned Google on this more than anything else, but we can Google, here's my postcode, who's my MP, what's my MP's email address. If every Christian had emailed our MP to say, actually, the Bible makes it clear that we should give. A lot of the church spent a lot of time coming up to the year 2000 campaigning that we increased our aid budget. The church had a huge momentum behind that project, and it happened. And now it's going. If the church all rose up and wrote and protested, maybe it would stay. Similarly, the situation for refugees, let's put pen to paper, or I don't know what the computer equivalent is, but let's write those emails. If that's something we feel strongly about, and this is another challenge for me, I'm very good at talking the talk, I need to type those emails. So I've talked about give, I've talked about acting, and I've sort of mentioned it, pray. We can ask God to show his compassion to us, to provoke that splagzimeo, that compassionate response. But we can also pray for that situation. We believe in intercessory prayer. We believe as we pray for situations that God can break through and God can change things. God can be working in those COVID situations, those crises in India and around the country. God can be working through the churches there. God can be working through the doctors there. So we need to pray for those people. And again, there are different charities that can give you names and faces to pray for. So, compassion. We've got sympatheia, compassion. There are some situations that can't be fixed. We need to grieve with those who grieve. Eleeo. Just because we don't feel it, that's not an excuse not to do anything. We need to respond. We need to pray about what that means. And splagzimeo, response. We need to feel that response, feel that emotion. Ask God to show us how he feels, give us his compassion, and then respond out of that compassion. So let's finish by praying. Father God, I thank you that you are a God who is compassionate. Mm-hmm. You're not a distant deity that doesn't connect with humanity, but we know out of your compassion for us, you came as Jesus. You showed your compassion, and then you showed your ultimate compassion for us by dying on the cross so that we might be free. And I pray that you will show us now your compassion for situations around the world, your compassion for situations we know about, for people we know about, and I pray that you will guide us to areas that you want us to intercede for, areas you want us to get involved with, laws you want us to speak up about, projects you want us to give to. Pray you'll give us that splagzimeo love, Lord. Pray you will show us those contacts, and you will help us to know how to respond, Lord. Help us to respond in the right way, at the right time. Help us to know when it's right just to sit and to grieve and to be with somebody. Help us to know when actually we just need to get on. We need to show mercy, we need to show compassion, and we need to get stuck in. Lord, we pray that you will move us. You will move us to be a church that is known for its compassionate response. Thank you for throughout history that is true, and I pray that you will help us to keep that legacy going, Lord.